On the morning of June 14, 2000, a 73-year-old retired U.S. Army Reserve colonel named George Trofimoff drove to the Tampa International Airport Hilton Hotel in Florida, expecting to collect a payment of $20,000 in cash from a man he believed was an officer of Russia's SVR Foreign Intelligence Service. Trofimoff had spent the previous 3 years cultivating this relationship with a contact who called himself Igor Galkin, a man who had first reached him by hand-delivered letter in July 1997, and who had, over dozens of phone calls and 2 lengthy recorded meetings, drawn out of him a detailed account of a career spent selling American secrets to Soviet intelligence. Galkin did not exist. He was the invented identity of FBI Special Agent Dmitry Druzhinsky, a Russian-speaking undercover specialist who had spent nearly 3 decades posing as a Soviet or Russian intelligence officer to elicit confessions from suspected American traitors. When Trofimoff walked into the hotel that morning, FBI agents arrested him. He was, according to the Justice Department's own description at the time, the highest-ranking officer in the history of the United States military ever charged with espionage. For 25 years, from 1969 until his retirement from Army civilian service in 1994, George Trofimoff had headed the United States Army's element at the Joint Interrogation Center in Nuremberg, West Germany, a NATO facility where American, British, French, and West German intelligence services jointly debriefed defectors and refugees fleeing the Soviet-bloc. It was one of the most sensitive listening posts of the entire Cold War, a clearinghouse for what the West believed it knew about the military capabilities, troop movements, and intentions of the Warsaw Pact. Trofimoff had access to virtually everything the center produced. According to the case later built against him, he spent that time quietly removing material from the center, photographing it, and passing it to Soviet intelligence through an intermediary who had grown up alongside him as a foster brother and who, by the time the operation was fully underway, had become a bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church. The story of how Trofimoff came to spy, how he evaded detection for so long, and how he was ultimately undone, not by a defector's memory or a photograph on a park bench, but by his own recorded voice, over 6 hours in a budget motel room, describing his own betrayal in his own words, is a story about the peculiar intimacy of Cold War espionage, in which recruiters exploited childhood loyalty and religious cover, in which detection depended as much on patience and archival luck as on tradecraft, and in which the final undoing of a spy came not from any foreign power, but from an American agent who spoke Russian well enough and understood loneliness well enough to become, for 6 hours, exactly the man Trofimoff had been waiting years to hear from. If cases like this one, the hidden histories and human costs behind Cold War intelligence operations, are what brought you here, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. We bring you one fully researched, documented case like this every week. George Trofimoff was born in Berlin on March 9, 1927, to a family of Russian émigrés, still reeling from the violence of the revolution that had exiled them. His paternal grandfather, Vladimir Ivanovich Trofimoff, had been a brigadier general on the Imperial Russian Army's general staff, the kind of officer the Bolsheviks regarded as an enemy of the new order. In 1919, during the chaos of the Russian Civil War, the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, arrested and shot him. George's father, Vladimir Vladimirovich Trofimoff, had trained at the Page Corps Military Academy and had fought as a major in the anti-communist White Army during the Civil War that followed the Revolution, the losing side, the side that scattered its survivors across Europe as refugees. George's mother, Ekaterina Katali, had been a concert pianist before her marriage in 1926. She died not long after George was born, and his father, unable to care for him alone, arranged for the boy to be raised by family friends, Vladimir and Antonina Sharavov. Antonina had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Igor Susimil, and it was in that household, among fellow Russian émigrés, rebuilding fragments of a lost world in Weimar and then Nazi Germany, that George Trofimoff and Igor Susimil grew up as foster brothers, The world they grew up in was one steeped in loss, and in a particular intense strain of anti-communism. Trofimoff would later describe, decades afterward, and with apparent sincerity, growing up hating the Soviet system because it had murdered members of his own family. That hatred would become central to how he explained himself for the rest of his life, even after it was no longer disputed that he had spent decades serving the intelligence apparatus of that same system. The Second World War scattered the family further. In 1944, as a teenager, Trofimoff was conscripted into the German army, a fate common to young men living in occupied and Nazi-controlled territory regardless of their family's politics. He escaped conscription's front lines by fleeing to Czechoslovakia, where he hid out for the remainder of the war. When the fighting ended, he made his way back to the American occupation zone of Germany and found work as an interpreter for the U.S. Army, a natural role for a young man fluent in Russian, German, and English, and one that placed him, for the first time, inside the American military and intelligence apparatus that would define the rest of his career. In 1947, sponsored by a Quaker relief organization, the Society of Friends, Trofimoff emigrated to the United States. The following year, in 1948, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1951 and was commissioned as an officer in the Army Reserve in 1953. He was honorably discharged from active duty in 1956, but continued his military career in the reserves, eventually retiring with the rank of colonel in 1987, a title that would follow him for the rest of his life, and the prosecutors would later invoke to underscore the singular gravity of his eventual betrayal. In 1959, Trofimoff took a civilian position with U.S. Army intelligence in Germany, working with the Army's 66th Military Intelligence Group. A decade later, in 1969, he was named Chief of the United States Army element at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center, known within the intelligence community by its acronym YICSENT. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary position of trust. The JIC existed to interview and debrief the steady stream of defectors, refugees, and émigrés who made their way out of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact states into West Germany, extracting whatever intelligence they could offer on Eastern Bloc military capability, troop dispositions, weapon systems, and the internal workings of Soviet institutions. As chief of the American contingent, Trofimoff held both secret and top-secret clearances and had access not only to what his own staff produced, but to the accumulated intelligence product of the entire facility, a library, in effect, of everything the West believed it understood about its adversary. It was around this same period, accounts differ on whether it began in the mid-1960s or coincided more precisely with his 1969 promotion, that Trofimoff renewed and deepened his relationship with his foster brother. Igor Susamiel had taken a very different path than George. He had entered the Russian Orthodox Church and, under the monastic name émigré, had risen through its clerical ranks, first as auxiliary bishop of Munich and West Germany, later as Archbishop of Vienna, and then Metropolitan of Austria, a position roughly equivalent, in Western terms, to a cardinal. The branch of the Russian Orthodox Church to which Susamiel belonged, the Moscow Patriarchate, operated under close Soviet state supervision, and its Fifth Directorate ties to the KGB were, within the intelligence world, an open secret. Orthodox clergy traveling internationally provided useful cover for officers and agents of Soviet intelligence, and the KGB is known to have cultivated multiple such relationships among Moscow Patriarchate clergy, both inside and outside the USSR. Susamiel was one of them. By his own later account, and by the account the U.S. government would eventually build against him, Trofimoff's slide into espionage did not begin with ideology. It began with money. Trofimoff was, by the description of nearly everyone who later wrote about him, a man of considerable personal appetite, fine cars, an active social life, a taste for living beyond the means his army civilian salary could support. He would go on to marry 5 times over the course of his life, and the financial strain of those relationships, combined with his general spending habits, left him chronically short of cash throughout his years in Germany. His own defense attorney would later concede as much in blunter terms. Whatever else was true, Trofimoff was not a careful budgeter of his own money. Suzemiel, who by the government's account was already working on behalf of the KGB, recognized in his foster brother's financial distress an opportunity. According to the federal indictment later filed against Trofimoff, Suzemiel recruited him into the service of the KGB after learning of his money troubles, what began, according to Trofimoff's own later admissions, captured on videotape decades afterward, as photographed pages and quiet handoffs to a trusted childhood friend, grew over time into a sustained intelligence operation. Trofimoff would remove documents from the Joint Interrogation Center, photograph them, and pass the film to Suzemiel, who carried it onward to Soviet and later Russian intelligence officers. The two men met periodically in Austria, where Suzemiel's ecclesiastical duties gave him ample cover for travel and for meetings with KGB handlers, including, according to later testimony, the former KGB general Oleg Kalugin, who headed the K branch of the KGB's Foreign Counterintelligence Directorate, and who personally credited Suzemiel with the recruitment of the asset the KGB would come to know internally by the code name Marquise. For his service, the KGB paid Trofimoff a standing weekly stipend. By Kalugin's later court testimony, roughly 7,000 Deutschmarks a week, delivered always in used bills, with additional lump sum payments for larger needs. When Trofimoff required money for a down payment on a house, Suzemiel is said to have gone to his Moscow contact and returned with 90,000 Deutschmarks, worth at the time roughly 40,000 American dollars. Over the full span of his espionage career, American prosecutors would later estimate Trofimoff received somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000, depending on the account, a substantial sum, but, set against his extraordinary access to one of NATO's most sensitive intelligence facilities, a strikingly modest price. The material he is alleged to have provided in exchange was, by the later assessment of KGB defector records, staggering in volume, more than 80 volumes and some 50,000 pages of documents, spanning the full period of his tenure at the JIC. What Trofimoff actually believed he was doing is a question the record leaves genuinely open. He offered contradictory versions of his own motives across the years, sometimes emphasizing debt and desperation, sometimes reaching for something closer to ethnic or ancestral loyalty, and eventually, after conviction, retreating into blanket denial that any of it had happened at all. In one recorded statement that would later be played for a federal jury, he explained the choice in terms of identity rather than ideology or cash, that in his soul, he said, he had always remained Russian rather than American, and that what he had done not for the Bolsheviks or the Communists, but for what he called the motherland. It is one of the more revealing lines to survive from the case, not because it resolves the question of his motive, but because it captures the peculiar way Trofimoff appeared to have narrated his own life to himself, as a man serving something older and more essential than the citizenship papers he had obtained in 1951, even as he built a career, a reputation, and 5 marriages inside the country whose secrets he was selling. The Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center operated in relative obscurity to the broader public throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and so, it seems, did Trofimoff's relationship with Soviet intelligence. He continued in his post as chief of the U.S. Army element until 1994, by which point the Soviet Union itself had already dissolved and the KGB had been reorganized into Russia's new Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. According to later reporting, the operation persisted through that transition, with Suzemiel continuing to serve as intermediary and courier even as the Cold War formally ended around them. The first serious crack in the operation's decades of concealment came not from any error by Trofimoff or Suzemiel, but from an entirely separate defection on the other side of the world. In 1992, a retired KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the United Kingdom, bringing with him what would become one of the most consequential intelligence hauls of the entire Cold War era: thousands of pages of handwritten notes, compiled secretly over 12 years inside the KGB's own archive as he helped oversee its relocation to new headquarters outside Moscow, smuggled out and, according to later published accounts, buried beneath the floor of his dacha. Mitrokhin had first approached American intelligence, which initially dismissed his material as a possible fabrication, before he turned successfully to British intelligence instead. He brought with him 6 trunks of notes spanning KGB operations from the 1930s through the 1980s, material that would later form the basis of historian Christopher Andrews' book The Sword and the Shield, and that the FBI itself would eventually describe as among the most complete troves of intelligence ever obtained from any single source. Buried within that vast collection was evidence that a NATO interrogation center had been compromised for years by a source the KGB internally called Marquise. Mitrokhin's notes did not include a name. His access, however extraordinary, had limits, but they offered a rough description. The source was said to be a career American intelligence officer, and the courier, who had carried his material outward, was described as a clergyman of the Russian Orthodox Church. The description was strikingly specific to a man in Trofimoff's own position. Years later, reflecting on that moment in an interview with CBS News correspondent Scott Pelley, Trofimoff himself described the match this way. An American intelligence officer who had passed material to the Soviets through a Russian priest fit him, in his own words, like a glove, and he added that he had no doubt his foster brother had been watched and in some sense controlled by the KGB during his travels outside the Soviet Union. It was a striking admission for a man who would spend the rest of his life denying that he himself had ever actually done what the description implied. That description was specific enough to point German investigators toward Susemil, and, through him, toward Trofimoff. In 1994, German authorities arrested both men in Nuremberg on suspicion of espionage. It was by any measure a serious break in the case. The 2 men who had spent decades running one of the KGB's most productive Cold War operations were finally briefly in custody, but the case German prosecutors could build rested on the same limitation that had made Mitrokhin's material so tantalizing and so incomplete. It was a description, not a name, and a German judge ultimately concluded there was insufficient evidence that Trofimoff and Susemil were, in fact, the 2 men the archive described. Compounding the problem, German law imposed a 5-year statute of limitations on espionage offenses, a window that had long since closed over conduct dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. Both men were released. Trofimoff and his 5th wife, Yuta, left Germany for the United States shortly afterward, settling in Melbourne, Florida, in a gated community for retired military officers called Indian River Colony Club, on a street named, with an irony that would not be lost on later reporters, Patriot Drive. For American investigators, though, the German case was not the end of the matter. The United States has no statute of limitations on espionage, and the FBI, together with Army counterintelligence, continued to build a case quietly in the years that followed Trofimoff's release. Susemil died in July 1999, having never faced prosecution in either country. His death appears to have complicated Trofimoff's own financial situation. He reportedly expected some form of inheritance connected to his foster brother's estate or church position that never materialized, but by then, unbeknownst to Trofimoff, the FBI had already set its own operation in motion. The FBI's approach to Trofimoff began on July 10, 1997, with a hand-delivered letter. It came from a man identifying himself as Igor Galkin, purportedly an officer attached to the Russian embassy in Washington. Galkin made repeated phone calls to Trofimoff over the following months, seeking a meeting and hinting at money that might be owed to him. Trofimoff, understandably wary after his 1994 arrest in Germany, was slow to respond and deeply skeptical of the approach. Galkin was, in reality, FBI Special Agent Dmitry Druzhinsky, a Russian-speaking undercover specialist whose entire career had been built around exactly this kind of operation, posing as a Soviet and later Russian intelligence officer to draw confessions out of suspected American spies who still believed, or hoped, that their old handlers had not forgotten them. Druzhinsky was, by the account of colleagues who spoke about him later, unusually effective at the role. In 1988, working the same kind of undercover approach, he had drawn a confession out of U.S. Army warrant officer James Hall III, who had spied for both the KGB and the East German Stasi. He had also, in an earlier assignment, posed as an Arabic-speaking playboy aboard a yacht in the Mediterranean in order to lure an airline hijacker into FBI custody. Russian was one of 9 languages he spoke, and it was, by his own account, years later, in high demand throughout the Cold War. American officials with secrets to sell tended to assume that Soviet intelligence would pay the most, and so undercover agents fluent in Russian who could plausibly present themselves as Soviet officers became one of the FBI's most effective tools for drawing such people out into the open. Druzhinsky's patience with Trofimoff paid off gradually. Over months of calls, he built enough trust that Trofimoff agreed to an in-person meeting. Posing as Galkin, Druzhinsky told Trofimoff a story crafted to appeal to both his vanity and his financial need, that a defecting Russian intelligence analyst had stolen or destroyed much of Trofimoff's old KGB file, and that in exchange for Trofimoff's help reconstructing the record of his years of service, the Russian government would see that he was compensated. On February 24, 1999, Trofimoff met Galkin at a Comfort Inn in Melbourne, Florida, not far from his home. The room was wired. For 6 hours, with FBI technicians recording video and audio from an adjoining room, Trofimoff described, in his own words, a career spent supplying material to Soviet intelligence. He told Druzhinsky that his old post in Germany had been what he called a gold mine, that there had been hundreds, thousands of pages, and that he had given them everything, that there was no document the Soviets had wanted that they had not received. He spoke of his desperate need for money, of the debts that had followed him for years, and in one striking moment captured on the tape, he put his hand to his chest and told the undercover agent that in his soul he was not American at all. Druzhinsky, still playing Galkin, assured him the SVR would look after him financially, but cautioned that it would take time to arrange. 5 months passed in silence. On May 10, 2000, Druzhinsky called again, reassuring an anxious Trofimoff, who had begun to fear he had been abandoned or forgotten, that nothing had changed, that the arrangements were simply taking time to finalize. The call set the stage for a final meeting, one at which Trofimoff was told he would finally receive the payment he had been waiting years to collect, $20,000 in cash. On June 14, 2000, George Trofimoff, then 73 years old, drove to the Tampa International Airport Hilton Hotel to meet Galkin and collect his payment. He did not know that the man he was meeting did not exist, that every conversation of the past 3 years had been recorded, and that FBI agents were waiting to arrest him the moment the meeting concluded. When it did, they took him into custody on the spot. Waiting outside in a car, according to later reporting, was Trofimoff's wife, reportedly as stunned by his arrest as his neighbors back in Melbourne would be in the days that followed. Those neighbors, interviewed by reporters after word of the arrest broke, described a friendly, unremarkable retiree, a man who, in the years leading up to his arrest, had been working part-time bagging groceries at a local supermarket to supplement his income, an image that would recur again and again in the press coverage that followed. A man accused of a lifetime of espionage, caught not in some dramatic dead-drop exchange, but arrested on his way out of a hotel meeting, having spent his final months of freedom checking out customers at a Florida grocery store. The arrest made national news within days. Newsweek, describing the case that same week, called it a coda to the Cold War, the tail end of a conflict most Americans had already filed away as history, resurfacing a decade after its formal conclusion in the form of an elderly colonel accused of selling NATO's secrets to Moscow. Trofimoff's trial opened at the Sam E. Gibbons United States Courthouse in Tampa on June 4, 2001, nearly a year after his arrest. He pleaded not guilty. His attorney, Daniel Hernandez, told jurors in his opening statement that his client categorically denied the charges, categorically denied working for the KGB, and categorically denied betraying his country. Hernandez did not dispute that Trofimoff had been close to Sous Emil, or that Susamiel had often lent him money. He told the jury that if not budgeting one's money well were itself an offense, then Trofimoff was guilty of that offense and nothing more. The defense's core argument was, on its face, difficult to reconcile with 6 hours of videotaped confession, that Trofimoff had never actually spied for the Soviet Union or Russia at all, and that everything he had told the undercover agent Druzhinsky, his descriptions of documents stolen, of meetings with KGB officers, of a career spent betraying his country, had been an elaborate lie, invented because he was, once again, desperate for money, and believed the man calling himself Galkin would only pay him if he presented himself as a valuable former asset with a real history of service. It was an unusual defense, essentially that Trofimoff had defrauded Russian intelligence by pretending to be a spy he had never actually been. The prosecution's case, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Terry Furr, under the Middle District of Florida's U.S. Attorney Donna Buscella, rested on 3 pillars: the videotaped confession itself, a body of documentary evidence establishing Trofimoff's extraordinary access to classified material throughout his tenure at the JIC, and, most unusually, live testimony from the other side of the old conflict. In his opening statement, Furr told jurors that Trofimoff had become virtually a salaried employee of the KGB, complete with bonuses, and that classified documents at the JIC had been kept in a room that looked something like a safe, but that access to the material had ultimately depended on little more than trust. Getting a classified document out of that building, Furr said, had been easier than walking down to the public library and checking one out. Former KGB General Oleg Kalugin, who had once headed K branch of the KGB's Foreign Counterintelligence Directorate and who had defected to the West years earlier, testified for the prosecution about Trofimoff's recruitment and about the honors the KGB had bestowed on him, including, according to Kalugin, the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet Union's highest military decorations, awarded in Kalugin's description for exceptional and dangerous service in defense of the state. Kalugin testified that he had personally thanked Susamiel for his role in recruiting the asset known as Marquise. The prosecution also called former U.S. Marine Clayton Lonetree, previously convicted in a separate, unrelated espionage case involving Soviet intelligence recruitment of Marine security guards, to testify about the general recruitment techniques the KGB was known to employ. Testimony meant to lend context and credibility to the broader pattern the government alleged Trofimoff's case fit into. Kalugin's testimony, while central to the government's case, was not without its own complications. Complications the defense worked hard to exploit. On the stand, Kalugin testified that he had personally met Trofimoff in Bad Ischl, Austria, roughly 150 miles from Nuremberg, but Kalugin had also written about an unnamed American spy, fitting Trofimoff's profile in his own published memoir, and the account in that book did not match his sworn courtroom testimony in several respects. The book described multiple meetings and placed at least one of them in a different city entirely. The defense seized on the discrepancy, arguing that if Kalugin was willing to alter facts for a memoir, his in-court testimony deserved no more credit than his prose. Trofimoff himself, pressed on the question by Pelly after the trial, offered a version of the same argument in blunter terms, that the entire case, stripped of Kalugin's testimony, amounted to nothing more than one man's word against another's. And when confronted with the fact that Kalugin had elsewhere admitted to including deliberate falsehoods in his book, Trofimoff turned the logic back on his own recorded confession, asking why, if the jury was prepared to disbelieve Kalugin's demonstrated lies, it should not extend him the same benefit of the doubt regarding the hours of admissions he had made to the man he knew as Galkin. It was, in its way, a coherent piece of reasoning, and it did not work. Jurors were, by their own account, more persuaded by 2 other elements of Kalugin's testimony that were harder to wave away. He had named, under oath, specific KGB officers who had worked with Trofimoff, and those names matched, almost precisely, names Trofimoff himself had independently supplied to the undercover agent Druzhinsky in earlier taped phone calls, a level of overlapping specificity that a fabricated story invented purely to extract cash, jurors reasoned, was unlikely to produce by coincidence. On June 26, 2001, after a 4-week trial, the jury deliberated for roughly 90 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Jury foreman Mark King told reporters afterward that a genuinely innocent man would have gone to the FBI the moment a supposed Russian intelligence officer first contacted him in 1997, rather than spending 3 years cultivating a relationship with him. King added that Trofimoff had often seemed to be lying on the stand, that his account of events simply did not hold together. Jurors reportedly found it particularly difficult to credit Trofimoff's defense after watching him, under cross-examination, correctly identify several actual Soviet-era spies from photographs shown to him by an undercover agent, a level of specific knowledge that sat uneasily beside his claim to have fabricated his entire history of service from nothing. Trofimoff showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. His wife, present in the courtroom, wept. He was sentenced on September 27, 2001, to life imprisonment, a sentence reflecting the length, scale, and sensitivity of the material the government believed he had compromised over a quarter-century. Even after his conviction, George Trofimoff never stopped insisting he was innocent. In the months following his sentencing, he gave an interview to CBS News' 60 Minutes Does Too, telling correspondent Scott Pelley that he considered himself a patriot who had served his adopted country faithfully for what he described as 46 or 47 years. He recanted the substance of everything captured on the Comfort Inn videotape, telling Pelley that he had lied to the undercover agent he knew as Galkin purely to extract money from him, using the same logic his trial defense had rested on. He maintained, until the end of his life, that he had never had any actual dealings with Soviet or Russian intelligence at all. The case against him, it is worth noting honestly, rested on an unusual evidentiary foundation. There was no physical espionage material recovered, no camera, no code book, no cache of cash tied directly and forensically to Soviet payment, no microfilm seized in a raid. What existed was the videotape confession itself, the largely uncorroborated testimony of a defected KGB general describing decades-old recruitment and reward, and the broader circumstantial architecture of Trofimoff's extraordinary access, combined with the Mitrokhin archives' earlier, non-specific identification of a mole at the Nuremberg Center, matching his general profile. Prosecutors themselves, during the trial, reportedly acknowledged that the case Trofimoff had allegedly run was in some sense a nearly perfect crime, a quarter-century of espionage that left behind almost no independent physical trace, undone in the end only by his own recorded voice. Trofimoff spent the remainder of his life in federal custody. He was ultimately held at the United States Penitentiary in Victorville, California, where he died on September 19, 2014, at the age of 87, having served 13 years of the life sentence handed down in 2001. He never recanted his claim of innocence in any subsequent public statement, and he never, so far as the public record shows, offered a full accounting, comparable in detail to what he told Druzhinsky on tape in 1999 of exactly what material passed through his hands, or exactly how much damage it caused. The formal damage assessment the U.S. government conducted into what the Soviet Union gained from decades of access to one of NATO's Central Eastern Bloc debriefing facilities has never, as far as available public sources indicate, been released in full to the public. What the record genuinely does not settle is nearly as important as what it does. Trofimoff's own account of his motives shifted across the years and across different audiences, and which version came closest to the truth is not something the court record definitively resolves. The human toll the case took on his family is, likewise, far less documented than in comparable cases involving younger defendants with children still at home. His final wife, Yuta, appears in the public record as present, both at his arrest and later weeping at his conviction, but her experience of the collapse of her husband's public identity was never, as far as available reporting shows, the subject of sustained press attention or personal testimony placed on the record. The public record contains no indication that Trofimoff had children of his own. Whatever grief or private reckoning his extended family experienced in the aftermath remains, to the extent it exists at all, largely outside the historical record available today. Trofimoff's case did not stand alone. He was arrested and prosecuted during a period spanning roughly the mid-1980s through the early 2000s, when American counterintelligence services publicly unraveled a long series of Cold War-era penetrations that had gone undetected for years or decades. CIA officer Aldrich Ames, whose spying for Moscow beginning in 1985 led to the deaths of multiple American intelligence assets inside the Soviet Union. FBI agent Robert Hansen, whose espionage for the Soviet Union and then Russia spanned more than 15 of his 27 years with the Bureau. Army Warrant Officer James Hall III, the very case that had first established Drudzinski's reputation as an undercover interrogator, and CIA officer Harold James Nicholson, caught attempting to leave the country with classified documents. Each of these cases, in its own way, exposed the same underlying vulnerability that had allowed Trofimoff to operate undetected for so long, a security clearance system built around periodic background checks and a baseline assumption of trust, rather than continuous monitoring of access, behavior, and financial circumstances over the full span of a career. Trofimoff's chronic debt, the same financial pressure that, by every available account, first opened him to recruitment, was never flagged as a red flag serious enough to trigger a deeper review, despite his holding one of the most sensitive access positions in the entire NATO intelligence structure for 25 years. In the years following Trofimoff's conviction, the Department of Defense and Allied Services moved to tighten exactly these kinds of gaps. More frequent reinvestigation of personnel holding long-term high-level clearances, closer scrutiny of unexplained wealth, or persistent debt among cleared personnel, and less reliance on the assumption that an officer's length of service and apparent loyalty were themselves a form of security. None of these reforms could reach backward to close the window during which Trofimoff had operated, and no public accounting has ever definitively established how much of what he provided actually altered Soviet military planning, doctrine, or confidence in confronting NATO forces. Retired General William Odom, asked by CBS News to assess the plausible scope of the damage, offered a measured judgment that Trofimoff, whatever his direct value to Moscow, could have given his Soviet handlers a reasonably clear picture of what the United States wanted to know about the Eastern Bloc. George Trofimoff's case does not resolve neatly into the kind of moral clarity that espionage stories are sometimes made to carry. He was, by his own repeated insistence even after conviction, either a loyal American who lied about being a spy to extract money from a foreign intelligence service, or he was a man who spent 25 years, more than a third of his life, the entirety of his most senior professional career, quietly disassembling the trust placed in him by two nations, the country of his birth, whose intelligence services he claimed on tape to have served all along in his soul, and the country that took him in as a refugee, granted him citizenship, entrusted him with classified material for decades, and ultimately convicted him for betraying that trust. The physical evidence in the case was thin by the standards later espionage prosecutions would establish. What convicted Trofimoff, in the end, was his own voice, recorded across 6 hours in a comfort inn, describing in specific and repeated detail a career he would later insist, under oath and in interviews, had never actually existed. A jury believed the tape. They deliberated for 90 minutes. What the tape cannot resolve, and what no court verdict can definitively settle, is the interior question underneath the case. What a man who spent his adult life presenting himself as a grateful, naturalized American, rising to a position of genuine trust within that country's military intelligence apparatus, actually believed about his own loyalties across all those years of quiet betrayal. Trofimoff offered, across statements to Drudzinski in 1999, to a federal jury in 2001, and to a national television audience shortly afterward, 3 different and not entirely compatible accounts of who he had been and why. He died in a federal prison in California in 2014, still insisting on the version in which none of it had been real, that the entire record the United States government had assembled against him was, in its entirety, a lie he had told for money to a man who did not exist. Whether that final claim was itself the last and most elaborate lie of a career built on them, or whether it was, and probably the truth, is a question the historical record leaves for others to weigh. What is not in dispute is the length of the access he held, the sensitivity of the facility he ran, and the years that passed before anyone, Soviet archivist, German prosecutor, or American undercover agent, was finally able to close the file on the man the KGB had known simply as Marquise.